There are many obstacles to equal opportunity for people of color in America, including employment, banking, and housing discrimination that limit opportunity and progress. Despite state and federal civil rights legislation that has been passed, including Title VII, anti-discrimination laws, and broad economic and diversity initiatives, a recent study conducted by the Economic Policy Institute revealed that companies have shown an increased push for workforce diversity, but the actual results have been gradual. Corporate citizens have a social and/or moral responsibility to diversify their workforce. To be fair, in the most recent 2 years, it's been difficult for many organizations to do so because of COVID, corporate downsizing, budget cuts, increased wages, and the Great Resignation, but the responsibility still remains. Study after study confirms that organizations with gender, ethnic, and cultural diversity are more likely to be more innovative and outperform their peers on profitability. Thus, there is a direct correlation between advancing diversity and economic gain. Simply put, this is good business. Historically, deep-seated systemic racism have stifled so many economic opportunities for communities of color. And this continues today, from redlining to mortgage lending discrimination to employment discrimination and limited access to venture capital. Racism has directly impacted the ability for people of color to build and pass on generational wealth. While progress has been made over the last 50 years, vast inequities still exist in these and many other areas, including voting rights, access to quality health care, education, and safe, livable communities. The 14th Amendment gives all people equal rights under the law. For people of color, racism makes the journey much more difficult and serves as an impediment towards progress. There are those who are privileged who are not affected by this. The definition of privilege means you don't have these barriers to success and can reach your goals faster. Some deny that this is a problem, but it's a huge problem in our communities, our state, and our nation, and the entire world. I believe that the only way that we can solve the problem is engaging in open and honest conversations as opposed to denying that this problem exists.
We at Everyday Democracy are equally proud to have celebrated day one of our 2-day Stand Against Racism Day series with the 2022 Civic Ambassadors Summit held this afternoon at the Hartford Public Library and on Zoom. We were honored to have with us Mr. Dwight Hawley, the keynote speaker and trainer at the summit. Mr. Hawley is a researcher, civic engagement specialist, trainer, and community advocate at Ohio State University Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. He has worked on a variety of civic engagement projects across the United States. Mr. Hawley is the author of The Principles for Equitable and Inclusive Civic Engagement, A Guide to Transformative Change, which was published by the Kirwan Institute in 2017. He spoke to us about using community engagement, social capital, and civic leadership to inform and impact decision-making, but to do so in ways that truly promote racial equity and justice. Mr. Hawley was quick to point out that civic engagement is more than just a set of practices. It is also a set of conditions. Therefore, the practice of civic engagement is inseparable from its larger cultural, political, or socioeconomic context. Given that we live in the context of systemic and institutional racism, civic engagement in communities of color is not immune from its impact. As he explained, and I quote, "The civic engagement environment is not just informed by what we practice, but also by how we are positioned in our communities. Indeed, in his report, The Principles for Equitable and Inclusive Civic Engagement, Mr. Hawley wrote, and I quote, "If civic engagements are developed with an expectation that contributions and challenges raised by marginalized populations are less valid, or if the general rules and guidelines that shape the activity produce barriers to engagement for those populations, then our engagement activities will continue to marginalize them regardless of the organizer's specific desire not to do so." So he challenges us to be more intentional about creating a culture of inclusive civic engagement opportunities and civic practices that promote equitable change.
The work that we do in schools and districts really prompts them to think very critically about complexified notions of data that tell us about the influence of systemic racism and institutional inequity. And that means that we, of course, are taking a look at achievement stats, we're taking a look at discipline data, special education classification and identification. We're taking a deep look at who's enrolled in AP and honors courses. We're asking a deep set of questions about our open choice programs that really underscore the idea of integrating communities cannot just mean that we put a different configuration of bodies together in a space, but rather that we have curated conditions where each of our children, but particularly Black and Brown children and those from historically excluded identities, feel welcomed, affirmed, and whole in their full and whole selves each and every day. And that may not necessarily be the case for everyone in our schools in this moment. So what are the ways where we assess that measure? What are the ways that we hold ourselves accountable? This requires us to think about how our students are connected to their learning, to their peers, to adults in the building. What does that mean in terms of youth who participate in clubs, student organizations, sports, or don't? What are those opportunities for parents, caregivers, and community members to be in a dialogue about how stereotypes and misconceptions can be reinforced at home, and how we might better support the work that our schools are doing to think critically about teaching and learning? Ultimately, the goal that we see is that we are positioning the children who we serve to both receive the education to which they are entitled, but first and foremost, that they see themselves as the agents of social change and institutional change that we hope for. It is my sincere belief, having worked with thousands of children across the country, that they will foster and lead a world that has things more sorted out than ours does in this particular moment when we think about cross-racial, cross-identity relationships. And I truly believe that educators are the ones who in this moment have an opportunity to disrupt and dismantle the influence of the historical structures of racism and systemic inequity that impact what we teach and how we teach. And that this is a moment that we cannot fail to capitalize on. It is a moment that will ask us to question ourselves, to question our educational system, and to really say that our kids deserve something better. Something more informed by what might make some folks uncomfortable, but will assuredly push us to stand up in all the ways that we need to against the continuous and perpetual influence of systemic racism in our schools.